When Levi Bellfield was arrested in 2004, during the investigation into the West London attacks, detectives initially focused on the crimes they could directly connect to him: the murders of Marsha McDonnell and Amelie Delagrange, and the attempted murder of Kate Sheedy. But as investigators continued examining Bellfield's history, his movements and the areas he frequented, they began to notice something unsettling. In 2002, when Millie Dowler disappeared, Bellfield had been living and working within driving distance of Walton-on-Thames. He had access to vehicles, and he had a known pattern of targeting young females walking alone. Linking Bellfield to Millie Dowler's murder wasn't simple. The case had already been under investigation for years. Evidence had to be re-examined, witness statements revisited, timelines reconstructed, but gradually investigators began building a case. One that suggested Bellfield may have encountered Millie during her walk home from school and taken her. Nearly a decade after Millie disappeared, the case finally returned to court. In 2011, Levi Bellfield stood trial for her murder. Prosecutors argued that Bellfield had abducted Millie during that short walk home from school, a moment of opportunity, a chance encounter that ended in tragedy. After hearing the evidence, the jury delivered its verdict. Levi Bellfield was found guilty of Millie Dowler's murder. For Millie's family, the verdict brought some form of justice. But like so many families in cases like this, justice could never undo what had happened. It could not bring Millie back. By the time the Millie Dowler case was resolved, Levi Bellfield had already been convicted of other murders: the attacks on Marsha McDonnell and Amelie Delagrange, the attempted murder of Kate Sheedy. But Millie's case revealed something even more disturbing, because it showed that Bellfield's violence had begun years earlier, long before detectives realised the pattern. For the Dowler family, the loss of Millie remains immeasurable. A life taken far too soon. A walk home that should have taken minutes, but changed everything. Next, the courtroom battles that finally brought Levi Bellfield to justice, and the sentence that ensured he would never walk free again. By the time Levi Bellfield stood trial, the case against him had taken years to build. Detectives had spent thousands of hours examining witness statements, reviewing forensic evidence, and reconstructing the movements of a man who had spent years moving unnoticed through the streets of West London. The crimes themselves had appeared random at first, sudden, unpredictable, but when investigators placed the pieces together, a pattern emerged. A man driving through quiet streets late at night, watching bus stops, looking for women walking alone, and striking without warning. In 2008, Bellfield was tried at the Old Bailey for 3 attacks that had shocked West London: the murder of Marsha McDonnell, the murder of Amelie Delagrange, and the attempted murder of Kate Sheedy. The courtroom heard detailed evidence about each case: witness accounts, vehicle sightings, forensic links, and the careful investigative work that had slowly narrowed the focus onto Bellfield himself. One of the most powerful moments in the trial came from Kate Sheedy. She described the night she had been struck by a car in Isleworth. At first, the incident had been treated as a hit and run, but her testimony revealed something far more disturbing. The vehicle had not simply lost control. It had turned deliberately toward her and then accelerated. Her survival gave the jury something investigators rarely have in cases like this: the voice of someone who had lived through the attack, someone who could describe the terror of those moments and explain why the collision had never been an accident. Prosecutors laid out the case methodically. Bellfield's vehicles matched descriptions from witnesses. His movements aligned with the timelines of the attacks, and forensic evidence linked him directly to the murder of Amélie Delagrange. Pattern became impossible to ignore. 3 attacks, 3 victims, all within the same areas of West London, all carried out with sudden, overwhelming violence. Bellfield himself remained largely silent throughout much of the proceedings. Observers described him as cold, detached, a man who showed little reaction as the details of the crimes were described. After hearing weeks of evidence, the jury retired to deliberate. When they returned, the courtroom fell quiet. The verdict was delivered. Guilty. Levi Bellfield was convicted of the murders of Marcia MacDonald and Amélie Delagrange and the attempted murder of Kate Sheedy. The judge described Bellfield as an extremely dangerous and predatory individual, and the sentence that followed reflected the severity of the crimes. Bellfield received a whole life order. In British law, a whole life order means exactly what it sounds like. The offender will spend the rest of their life in prison. There will be no release, no parole, no return to society. But the story did not end there, because investigators had continued examining Bellfield's possible connection to the murder of Millie Dowler. Nearly a decade after her disappearance, the case finally returned to court. In 2011, Bellfield was tried again. This time for the murder of the 13-year-old schoolgirl whose disappearance had once shocked the entire country. The jury heard the evidence, the movements, the opportunity, and the pattern of behaviour that now defined Bellfield's crimes. Once again, the verdict was guilty. Bellfield was convicted of Millie Dowler's murder, and another whole life sentence was added. With the verdict delivered, Levi Bellfield was taken into custody to begin the rest of his life behind prison walls. He would never be released, but even with the legal process complete, questions remained, because detectives could not say with certainty that Bellfield's crimes had begun with the cases already known, or that they had ended there. Some investigators believed there could be other victims, other attacks that had never been linked to him, and that possibility continues to haunt the case. The man who had stalked the streets of West London had finally been stopped, but the story of Levi Bellfield is not only about the crimes themselves, it is also about how someone capable of such violence lived among ordinary communities for years, working, driving, raising children, all while hiding a darker reality behind an ordinary life. Next, the lasting legacy of the case and the unsettling questions that still remains. How many warning signs were there before anyone realised what Levi Bellfield truly was? When Levi Bellfield was sentenced to spend the rest of his life in prison, many people believed the story had finally reached its end. The man responsible had been identified, the investigation had uncovered the truth, and the courts had ensured he would never again walk the streets of London. But cases like this rarely end with the final verdict, because long after the courtroom empties, the consequences remain. For the families of the victims, the years after the trials have been defined not by legal outcomes but by loss. Marcia MacDonald was 19, a young woman beginning her adult life. She had dreams, plans, and the kind of future that should have stretched out for decades. But her life ended on a quiet street near a bus stop in Hampton. Amélie Delagrange had come to London from France. She was building a life in a new country, surrounded by friends who described her as warm, energetic, and full of curiosity about the world. Her time in London should have been the start of something exciting. Instead, it became the place where her life was taken. And then there was Millie Dowler, just 13 years old, a schoolgirl walking home from class.